an entity. So therefore, it didn't
Everything's
count.
recorded.
It didn't count as bug.
Okay, everyone, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We've got a lot to cover today, so I would like to try and leave some questions at the end if we can. So thanks all for coming to our talk this afternoon. We're going to go through this new thing in Drupal called recipes and really focus in particular on ones that are related to managing dates and times. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Martin Anderson-Clutz. I am a principal solutions engineer at Acquia, and I'm also on a podcast called Talking Drupal. And last year I served as the events recipe track lead as part of the Starshot initiative. I've done a bunch of certifications, and if anybody wants to reach out to me, you can reach me as ManClue on a variety of Drupal and social platforms. Now, today also happens to be a special day because for people who are fans of sports ball, the Toronto sports team is in a momentous World Series appearance. This is a picture of me the last time the Blue Jays won the World Series. So you can tell that's a few years ago. Now, working with dates and times is notoriously fraught with different kinds of complexities that you might run into, particularly once you start working with dates and times that span time zones. Maybe you're getting into recurring dates, a variety of other ways to add complexities to managing dates and times. Now, technologies are often built with the intent to be helpful, but in practice turn out to be less than helpful. And so we definitely don't want to build Drupal sites that do this kind of a job at interpreting provided dates. Fortunately, the recipes system that we're going to talk about can make it really easy to set up sites that can do even very sophisticated date and time handling. And so let's dive in and talk about how we're going to do that. We're going to start by talking about why we need this thing called recipes, go straight to a live demo. Then we'll talk about the anatomy, what makes up a recipe, how you can apply them to your site, some of the things that are new and exciting in the recipe system, and then finish off by talking specifically about a variety of recipes directly related to managing dates and times. So for starters, why do we need this thing called recipes? Well, for a long time, Drupal has had this concept of distributions as a way to sort of quickly set up a site that had a robust set of capabilities. Actually, maybe let's just pause here and sort of pull the room. Put your hand up if you've ever worked with a Drupal distribution, and keep your hand up if you've never had a problem running a Drupal distribution. Okay, all of the hands went down. That's usually what happens. So notoriously, distributions introduce a variety of problems. So they're complex for the actual distribution maintainer, which causes downstream problems for the people managing the site based on that distribution. Sometimes it blocks them from doing things like applying security updates, which is obviously a pretty big deal. You can't they're not composable. You can't use, let's say, parts of the Commerce Kickstart distribution with like parts of the Red Hand Razor distribution. You have to sort of pick a lane. And they also are not necessarily the easiest things to find when you're starting your website, which is a problem because you can't add them later on. You have to sort of start over with your distribution, which is why the Drupal community has come up with this idea of recipes as kind of a lightweight and composable way to add capabilities to your website. So they don't contain any code of their own, but they can install other modules. You apply a recipe to a Drupal site, not install. And really by design, they're meant to be sort of easy to share, and probably most importantly, they don't lock you into a certain approach. So you can apply a recipe, use the parts that you want, rip out the parts that you don't, start over with a different recipe, those kinds of things. I also think it's important to sort of give credit to recipes for solving a problem that's really been something the Drupal community has struggled with for a long time. So one of the things that's amazing about Drupal is that we have this very rich ecosystem of contributed modules, so literally thousands of modules that you can use to solve your problems. But the problem is somebody that's new to the Drupal community doesn't know which modules to use to solve a very common problem. And so they might struggle and sort of try to find the right module, try and figure out what's the right way to get it set up, and all of those kinds of things. And so recipes really hold the promise of when people come to Drupal and want to solve those common problems, having kind of an out-of-the-box way to set up sort of the logical chunks of their website so they can really focus on the parts that are really more custom to their specific needs. And there was a thing earlier this year that was very exciting in the Drupal community called Drupal CMS, really designed to provide a more sort of opinionated and out-of-the-box experience for people trying Drupal for the first time. It actually comes with not only Drupal core, but a variety of contrib modules, all pre-configured. And so it was kind of a big deal, but also for our purposes today noteworthy, because really Drupal CMS is in many ways a big collection of recipes. So on that note, let's actually get hands-on and see some of these things in use. So here is Drupal CMS in the process of being installed. So if you download the code base, this is literally the first screen that you'll see, and it's asking us which kinds of content we want to be able to manage on our site. So we can select, let's say, for our example, obviously we're going to go with events. But really what we're choosing here are which recipes do we want the installer to actually incorporate into our installation from the very beginning. So we'll go with some defaults here in terms of the site name and the user account. And now it's going through the process, you can see, of installing not just Drupal core, but a variety of contrib modules, getting those configured, and then towards the end we'll see it doing the same for that events recipe. Now, has anybody already tried Drupal CMS? Anybody have it running in production? Okay. Sometimes there's one. All right, so we're almost done here, but what we're going to be able to see, it's going to take us directly to a dashboard, and then on there we can see some pages that have been automatically created as part of that installation, and notice here that we have the ability to go in and create an event. So we can call this a test event, we can grab something from the media library. We can set our date, so let's say maybe we're going to have our event happen on Halloween at the Acquia Boston offices. And let's go there and give it a description. And then if we save that, what we're going to be able to see is an unpublished draft of this event. It's grabbed something from the media library. It's actually, geocoded the address and created a map, but because of the privacy features built into Drupal CMS, it's not going to show that because it would expose our IP to a third-party service. So we have to opt in to see the map, and now we can see that there as well. So the other thing I'll sort of quickly show in Drupal CMS, in addition to being able to select those recipes during the initial install, if you go into the Extend menu, you have this tab for recommended add-ons, and these are all a variety of additional recipes. Some of these are the same, but then you also have additional features you can add in here, like your AI assistant, accessibility tools, SEO tools, and more. So again, a visual way to sort of apply those recipes to your site. Also wanted to show what the process looks like if we want to add recipes to more of a stock site based on Drupal core. So this is a fresh install of Drupal 11. If we go in here, we can see that we've got just sort of article and basic page for content that we can add. So let's go to the command line and let's go ahead and add some recipes. So we're going to go ddev drush recipe. Point it to the path to the recipe that we want to apply, and in this case it's just events. So it's going to do, hopes if I don't fat finger the address, the path, there we go. So it's going through the same process that we saw the visual installer going through on the Drupal CMS example, and now if we go ddev best practices to clear cache, rebuild the cache. Now if we go back to our site and refresh, now you'll notice that we have this events page. We can go in a similar way, add an event. So let's call this our test event. Set it to Halloween. And notice that there are actually fewer options out of the box because this set of events recipes are meant to be more sort of granular and composable. So out of the box, when you add just the events recipe, It's going to set up your content type and just sort of the base field, but we do have a view with displays for both upcoming and past events. But we can also go in and now add additional capabilities. So maybe we want to be able to manage recurring dates. So it's recurring. Maybe we want to, in a similar way, have an interactive calendar. So it's calendar. Maybe we want to also be able to associate locations with our events. There's a recipe for that. And then the last one we're going to do is add an ability for people to actually register for events directly within our Drupal site. And then with that done, once again we will rebuild our cache because it's Drupal. And now when we refresh our page, notice that within our events area now we have this new tab for a calendar. We also have a locations area, because the events location recipe that we applied itself depended on a locations recipe that sets up a content type specifically for adding locations. So in a similar way, we can say, let's add Acquia Boston here. Give it the same address, 53 State Street, and we can save that. And we're going to be able to see that it's done the same thing in terms of geolocating the address. This being a stock version of Drupal doesn't have the same privacy filters out of the box, or privacy features out of the box, so we're seeing the leaflet map right away. But now if we go back to our event here, let's go in. It actually does come with the add to calendar links out of the box, but if we go back in here, we can see now we have the ability to either add a location in line within the same form, or we can say add an existing one. So let's grab the Acquia Boston office. And notice now we also have an option for registration types. So the registration recipe that we applied has sort of registration types. So you can basically create bundles or fieldable entities for your kinds of registration. So maybe you need to manage some events where you want to capture t-shirt sizes, and other events where as part of registration you want to capture food allergies. You can do those as different registration types, and then based on the kind of event, any specific event can be assigned the appropriate type of registration. So let's go ahead and save that. The other thing I meant to do in here is also point out now we can make this a recurring event. So we could say make this recur weekly and end after 6 times. And now when we save that, notice that we now also have a formatter that's optimized specifically for recurring events. In there we've got our location showing. We could have a map there if we wanted to, simple configuration change, and we also have our registration form. Now if we go back to our events area, we can also go into the calendar and see what that looks like. This is all using the full calendar JavaScript library, but fully integrated with Drupal. So we can drag and drop if we want to change the date. We can go into the date view, so we could also drag and drop to reschedule when during the day this is going to happen, or even the duration. And if we go, let's say, up to the weekly view, we could also do things like drag and drop to make this an all-day event, and even have it span multiple days. And if we click through to the event, we can see that that's all been updated in the database as well. So just a couple of minutes, added quite a bit of sort of event-related functionality into our stock Drupal site. Hopefully gives you a sense of the power of using recipes. All right, so let's dive back in to our slides and talk about what goes into a recipe. So the most important file in a recipe is going to be the recipe.yaml file. Structurally, it has some similarities to like an info.yaml file that you would see in a module or a theme, but it has these sections that really define what the recipe is going to do. So you have a section where you can define other recipes that should be applied. You have a section where you can specify modules or themes that should be installed. When it does so, unlike the standard module installer, it will not import all configuration entities provided by that module, but only the basic configuration. So think about like what would be on the settings page for a particular module. And so if you want to also have it import things like configuration entities that are provided by that module, you can specify those in this config import section. And then finally, you have this ability to specify config actions, which are a really, really flexible way to modify the configuration of the site to which you are applying this recipe. And I like to think that in many ways, the recipe system is like the meat of Drupal CMS, and config actions are like the hot sauce that make it exciting. Now, most recipes will also include a composer.json file that will define things like the dependencies, so that a composer can pull those down and make sure they're available to the recipe. Optionally, you can also have a folder of static config files that will get imported as a part of applying that recipe, as well as a folder for content entities that should also be created when that recipe is applied. So here's an example of a contrib recipe that you can actually find on Drupal.org. So again, we've got our recipe.yaml, we've got our composer.json, a variety of static config files, and then in this case, it's got 3 different taxonomy terms that are going to be created whenever you apply this particular recipe. Note that in this case, when you generate them, it defaults to using the UUID as the file name, but you can change it to whatever makes most sense for you. But critically, they should be ideally grouped into a subdirectory keyed by the machine name of the kind of entity that you're intending to create. So the composer.json, as we talked about, is pretty similar to a standard composer.json, so name, description, keywords. The critical difference here is that you give it a type of Drupal recipe, and then as you would with any other kind of project, you set what other dependencies should be brought down for it, and then you can also use this suggest key to maybe prompt the user for other add-on projects. Could be other recipes, other modules that might extend the capabilities provided by your recipe. Right now, this only shows up on the command line at the very end of applying your recipe, but there is maybe prompt people to apply those additional suggested projects as well. The recipe.yaml again starts very similar to a project's info.yaml, so name, description, type. But now we have this option to specify other recipes that we want to have applied. We can also specify projects, in this case modules, that we want to have installed. And then if there are some of those configuration entities that we want to have imported from those projects, we can specify those under this config import key. Note that you have the option to either provide a wildcard to say, pull down all of the configuration entities provided by that project, or you can specify particular ones that you want to make sure will be available after the recipe is applied. That brings us to config actions. And each config action really has 3 parts. So you have basically the configuration entity ID that you want to manipulate, the actual action name for the action that you want to use, and then you have arguments, and the number of arguments will depend on which action you're running, as well as whether you're using the singular or the plural form of this particular action. So in the example we see here, it's using the simple config update action to modify the system theme and change the default theme to be Emulsify. It's worth pointing out that there are really sort of 2 major classifications for config actions. So there are sort of global ones that you can use to update any kind of configuration. So simple config update is one we just saw. Create if not exists is another pretty common one. Also set component and set third-party setting are ones that are pretty popular in the wild. This QR code will take you to a listing in the documentation page, and I will also make the slides available at the end as well. The other sort of big set of config actions, and probably actually a much larger set in terms of the number of actions available, are config actions that are really specific to certain kinds of entities. So as an example, if you want to manipulate a role, there is a grant permissions config action to specifically add 1 or more permissions to the role specified. In a similar way, if you are working with workflows, you can add node types, taxonomy vocabularies, and so on. Last time I checked, I think there was around 40 different config actions that are entity specific, but again, you can go here to the list and see the most recent version of what all are supported. Within config actions, there is also the opportunity to use wildcards to save you from having to sort of make repetitive recipes to do the same thing again and again to manipulate different entities. So as an example, if you want to add this access content permission to all roles that are available on a website, you can use this wildcard notation that you see here as sort of a single step that will apply those broadly. Or another example that we have here is if you wanted to add the field tags component to every view display of every content type, you can actually use a pair of wildcards as part of the definition for this particular config action. But again, there's more documentation in the link that's provided here. You will also have, as an example, there's a newer config action is for placing blocks, and I think this is a really good example of how config actions are significantly more flexible than what we had available previously. So previously, a module or a theme could place a block, but you would have to specify which theme to use, which region to use, and a numerical value for the weight in terms of where it should be placed. Which is pretty constraining because you have to know which theme a site is using, what regions those have available, and you couldn't guarantee that by giving it a certain numerical value that it would be where you intended it. So you might give it a value of a weight of like -10, hoping that that's enough to get it to the top, but there might already be blocks placed on that site with a weight of -50 or -100 or -1000. So now you have these config actions where you can say, I want to place a block, place it in the default theme, and it will do the work of figuring out what is the site's default theme and then place it in there. You can specify basically an array of different regions. So in this example here, we can see if it's the Bootstrap theme, then put it in the footer. If it's the Gesso theme, put it in the page bottom. If it's the Olivero theme, put it in footer top. And if it's none of those, try and put it in the default region, which here we've specified as the content region. And then we can also use these keywords for placement of first or last, and then it will actually do the work of looking at the existing blocks and figuring out the actual numerical weight that it needs to be able to have it appear where it's intended. By default, recipes tend to use this sort of strict comparison. So if you provide, let's say, the definition of a content type, and there's already a content type by that name that has different configuration, then the recipe will basically throw an error and refuse to apply. But you can do things like, as of 11.1, you can say config strict false, which basically means if it sees that there is an existing entity with the same name, it'll just say, that's fine, I don't need to worry about it. Or the other thing you can do in your recipe is to specify specific ones. So basically what that tells the recipes runner is, I'm only worried about a strict comparison for the ones that I label here, and all of the rest of them you can use in sort of that less strict comparison. Config actions are also an API, so you can basically define a plugin that will create your own config action. You need to provide the ID that should be used to run the action. You can optionally provide an array of entity types for which this can be run, and then optionally also provide a driver if there needs to use a class to sort of, potentially provide different functionality based on things like which entity type it is. I know for a fact that Search API was one of the first to actually provide its own config actions, so I think it's pretty interesting that now we're already seeing modules in the contrib space starting to sort of take up this API and implement it as well. Some best practices if you want to create your own recipes. There is this concept of idempotency, which is a word that I had not heard spoken, I think, until a couple of years ago. Basically the idea that you should be able to apply a recipe again and again and not have errors. Actually, in the demo that we saw, the events recipe was actually applied to the same site 5 times because it was a dependency of all of the 4 other recipes that we applied. It's a good idea, I would say, to try and keep them granular. So like we saw with the events example, if you only needed a simple implementation to not have more than you need, I think is a best practice. And finally, publish them. There's an easy way, you can publish them to Drupal.org as a general project, or really just to any kind of a repo management that has packagist integration. Again, as long as you set that sort of Drupal recipe type in your composer.json, people will be able to use that as a recipe. As we saw, there is that ability to include content within your recipe. Effectively, what they've done is taken the import mechanism from the default content module and put that directly into core as part of the recipe system. For exporting content, today the solution is really to, again, use the default content module to do the export. It will sort of group those based on the entity type, and then you can just move those folders into your content directory within your recipe. In 11.3, this will also be in core, so without having any additional contrib projects, you will be able to export the content as well. So here's an example of kind of a more built-out recipe.yaml. This is actually the locations recipe that we applied earlier as part of that events locations recipe. So you can see here, it's specified to install a variety of both core and contrib projects. And then for some of those, it's actually saying make sure that you actually import all of the provided configuration entities. And then using a couple of configuration actions, config actions to do things like set up the form display. So only if there isn't an existing form display, go ahead and set that up, and then set the actual order in which the fields should appear as part of that form. So if you want to apply recipes to your website, certainly the easiest way is going to be if your site is based on Drupal CMS, to pick those during the initial install, or to use the project browser as we saw before. But if you need to do it on the command line, there's a couple of different ways. To me, the simplest is definitely to use this drush command, but it's effectively just a wrapper of the first one, the PHP. So it's also useful to understand the order in which the recipe runner will go through the different information you provided. So it's going to start by applying any other recipes that are specified. Then it will install modules and themes, then import the specified configuration, so again, the configuration entities. Following that, it will import any provided configuration, so that directory of static files. Then it will apply the configuration actions in the recipe.yaml. And then the very last step will be to import any content that is provided as YAML files. So some of the more recent things that have happened in the recipe community. One of the new things is this concept of unpacking recipes. So when you use Composer to pull down a recipe, you can apply the recipe, and then your site will have configuration that now depends on a set of dependencies that if you were to Composer remove the recipe, you would have configuration depending on things that actually are no longer in your code base, which would basically leave your site in a broken state. So as of, I think it was 11.2, there is now a Composer script that when you pull down a recipe will actually take the dependencies of that recipe and copy them into the Composer file of your site, composer.json, and then effectively does not add the actual recipe itself to your composer.json. So the recipe will be there. You can apply the recipe one or many times, as many as you need. It will apply, but you will still have those dependencies in your composer.json so that they'll get updated on an ongoing basis as well. We saw before how you can use wildcards to make your config actions more dynamic. There are also some new options, so sort of placeholders to make it easy to do those sort of more flexible ways of potentially creating sort of a broad set of config actions. Again, in this example here, by using things like the bundle as a placeholder for things like setting permissions. If you want to start playing around with recipes, there is this recipes cookbook. This is effectively a wiki page on Drupal.org. There are site starter recipes on there. There are also some that are sort of more specific functionality that they provide. All of the events recipes that we saw earlier are going to be on this page. But by all means, if you start creating your own recipes, go to this page and add them so that as a community we can have discussions around what everybody thinks are the best practices for solving those common problems. There is also really good documentation for the recipe system, although unfortunately most of it today lives in GitLab. So there is some work to be done to sort of get that ported over to sort of the main Drupal.org documentation. And if you're interested in starting to contribute to the recipe system, this could be a great way to get started. So let's use some of our time remaining to talk about the events specific recipes that we saw earlier. So the events recipe that we applied will create that event content type, add a smart date field, and the add to calendar links. It does create a view with displays for upcoming and past events. And in terms of ongoing work, there's probably going to be continued sort of UX refinements, as well as an issue where there's accessibility improvements being discussed. And there is also a core issue to fix a quirk of views around using a default tab menu item. The link is actually on the project page for that events recipe. So if you're using that, I would encourage you to apply that patch to your site. The events location recipe that we applied does have that dependency itself on the locations recipe, which will go through and set up sort of address and geo field for handling the addresses, and then nominate them, which is part of the OpenStreetMaps project, as a free geocoding service, so you can use it out of the box without having to provide any kind of an API key. And then it's using Leaflet as a free and extensible mapping solution. Really all that the events locations recipe is going to do is add kind of a reference field on the events content type to point to those locations so you can attach them as we saw. The events calendar that we saw is based on a refreshed version of the full calendar module. Really it has code in there to provide sort of the drag and drop editing, something that I didn't actually show. You can double click in the calendar to add events at a specific time or date. And there are there's ongoing work to provide some important performance improvements for things like AJAX loading, as well as being able to manage tooltip display on hover. The events registration that we saw is based on the entity registration module. As we talked about, it has that ability to have sort of fieldable registration types. There's probably some refinement that we could do in terms of making the overall flow of actually registering for an event a little bit smoother. So if you have any thoughts on that or how it could be improved, by all means chime in the issue queue. And then the last one that we saw was the events recurring recipe, which in my mind is probably the simplest recipe that I ever worked on. It really, if you know things like the Smart Date module and how to set it up, probably will only save you a few minutes of effort. But I think it's important for, again, people that are new to the community to have a very simple way to be able to get that all set up without having to sort of learn the complexities of where to go to make certain changes. So all it's going to do is install a submodule of Smart Date called Smart Date Recur, make one change to the actual field configuration, switch the formatting, and then add a permission to the editor role. And also, none of these things are particularly time consuming, but again, you have to know what needs to be done and where to do them to make that easy. And so applying the one recipe gets all of that done for you in a single step. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about is something called the event platform. So the event platform was really created to make it easy to set up websites for events like a Drupal camp. It replaces the older Camp Organizers Distribution, or COD as it was known in the Drupal community. So it gives you a single place to manage your overall event information. It will set up content types for things like sessions, featured speakers, sponsors, and more. It will send out automatic email notifications when a session is submitted, accepted, and so on. And it provides tools for bulk generating time slots, drag and drop scheduling, and a few other things. It also gives you the ability to sort of like sessions and then see features that were added to the event platform in 2025 include improvements for multilinguals, content, being able to rate sessions directly within the website, being able to use those average ratings as a way to bulk moderate sessions, It now has support for multiple events, so if you have an annual camp, you don't have to sort of refresh it every year. You can sort of have those associated with a new event and sort of keep all of the content within a single site. Event Platform now has its own sort of purpose-built theme called Event Horizon, and there is sort of a plan to migrate those to recipes. The first step of that has been creating something called Event Platform Starter, which technically was built as a recipe, but as it turns out, is maybe a bit more complicated than the recipe runner is designed to handle. So today it's useful as kind of a composer template to bring down all of the dependencies that you'll need if you want to start a site based on Event Platform. And then in the README file, it provides a set of instructions. It's really only about 10 commands on the command line, and then you'll have your Event Platform site fully set up. If you want to just try it out, there is also a template set up on Drupal Forge, so in just a couple of minutes you can have a fully ready site to play around with. And then if you like the result, then you can sort of download that locally and then migrate that to whatever hosting platform you would choose. The very first event to use the Event Platform was Drupal Dev Days in Vienna a couple of years ago. But the most recent is actually the event we're at today, so Southwest Ontario Drupal Camp. Hopefully all of you are familiar with this website already, but you were actually using Event Platform as part of using that. So regardless of how you want to use dates and times in Drupal, there are a variety of off-the-shelf solutions. So we saw using the events recipe as part of Drupal CMS, the events recipe ecosystem, so all of those more granular recipes, as well as the features built into the Event Platform. Now, hopefully one of these solutions will meet your needs and you can sort of just drop that into whatever project you're using. But if not, then looking at how those are implemented can also guide you towards what some of the best practices are in the space. There is also a date time channel in Drupal Slack, and so if you need more guidance, by all means, drop a message in there as well. But hopefully you can see how recipes make it easy to adopt and implement a variety of community-provided best practices, and also make Drupal more inviting for people new to the community as well. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Do you find it difficult to test like custom recipes, like other than like, oh, it didn't make the thing or it didn't turn on something, like trying to debug that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so the question was, is it difficult to test custom recipes? I think the whole field around testing recipes is probably newer because the recipes system itself is newer. So probably if you were to ask around in the Drupal CMS channel, they would probably have some ideas in terms of exactly what the best practices are there. But yeah, that's probably where I would start. Yeah, there's a question over there.
Versioning, how you can tell the recipes to update, I don't know.
So the question was about versioning and tracking different versions potentially of recipes. So versioning is an interesting question because recipes are really intended to act as a starting point. So they're not intended to work like features where you can sort of, let's say, apply a recipe and then if there's a newer version of the recipe, be able to adopt whatever changes are in the newer version. In some cases, you might be able to reapply the newer version of the recipe and get additional features if that's was part of that newer version. But if there was, let's say, a particular configuration change as part of that newer version, it's not necessarily guaranteed that you would get that configuration change if you reapplied the newer version. So that's a little bit of a tricky question. I think, recipes still being new, I don't think we've had a lot of experience of seeing how those, downstream effects are. There is a project, I think it's called Recipe Tracker, that will keep a log effectively of what recipes were applied by whom and which version, and so that will at least give you that history. That can be useful as well if like you're maybe going to be down the road moving a project between teams, or like expect to hand it off. Let's say you're building it for a customer and then handing it off to their internal team. For them to have that kind of history could be really useful, but today those I would say are probably the best solutions available. Any other? Yep, in the back.
Yeah, I haven't used recipes a lot, but if you say use the events recipe, you make some configuration change, field format, form display, whatever, and then, oh, I want to add the locations. From what I just heard, the events is reapply, so does that change the configuration of what changes you make?
So the question was, when you use a recipe and then make configuration changes afterwards, does that prevent you from being able to reapply the recipe that you had started with?
Or use an extension of the recipe?
Right, or to extend that with other recipes that depend on it. So the answer is that it shouldn't. To some degree, it will depend on how the recipe itself was created. Certainly the events examples that we've seen shouldn't stop you from being able to reapply the base recipe or add on those additional ones, because they are made in a way where it's using some of the config actions like create if not exists and some of those other things, again, specifically to have item potency, not just for running the identical recipe, but also to be able to reapply that same recipe on a site that might have some sort of like minor differences. So like if you've got an additional field, that shouldn't stop you from either reapplying the base recipe or adding on any of the extensions. I think there was another one. Yes.
I think I'm getting the sense of this, but I was curious, like, is there any concept of like removing a recipe, sort of uninstalling?
You're right. So the question was, is there a concept of removing or uninstalling a recipe? So again, the language plates for recipes would say, remove as opposed to uninstall. But I would say today, the best answer, I mean, number one, you should always be applying recipes on sort of like a local version of the site. And then once you have that configuration, then doing a fresh export of your config and then pushing that up to a development environment and, going through that sort of standard deployment workflow. So on a local version, you could just, revert the database or sort of like reset the config folder, those kinds of things as sort of the standard way to just revert back to the previous state. There is a notion in the recipe system of config snapshots. So effectively, when you apply a recipe, it's going to take a config snapshot to say, this is a good version of the site configuration. And then if in the process of trying to apply that recipe, it encounters like a missing dependency or some kind of a validation error, then it will automatically revert back to that snapshot. So theoretically, I've heard it discussed that there could be like a module that exposes those config checkpoints so that you could just say like, oh no, let's just roll back to that. And so having more of a UI for that. But that doesn't exist today. So if that's something you're passionate about, then scratch your own itch. That's what Drupal is for. Any other questions? All right. Yeah.
So I'm just curious what happens if a recipe has the same field name that you've already created. Will it warn you, throw errors? Will you run into that?
So the question is, if a recipe wants to use a field name that's identical to one that you've created, how will it react? So again, it sort of depends. If the recipe is built in a way that that isn't using strict comparison, it's possible that it will be able to apply anyway. What I've seen from best practice is that typically most recipes that you'll see, sort of in the contrib space, will probably be using non-strict comparisons for like, what fields are in a form, but for like field storage, we'll probably make those strict because obviously your site's going to go kind of haywire if it's trying to store things in ways that aren't compatible with how the field is actually defined. So it should be okay, but again, provided that it's the same kind of field, whereas if it's the same field name but a different kind of storage, then at that point it wouldn't make sense for you to apply that recipe anyway. Any other questions? If not, I can give you all a few minutes back. So, looks like we're good. Thanks all.